Hello, my dear friends. It is a pleasure to meet you again. Today, I am going to bring you a very interesting story that I am sure you will love. Prepare a cup of tea, a comfortable seat, and enjoy the story right now. A billionaire weds a homeless woman as part of a bet, but what he discovers on their wedding night changes everything. Alex Walker, a self-assured billionaire with an icy demeanor, who stood at the edge of an opulent gala. His arrogance was unshaken until an old friend, Ryan Carter, approached him with a sly grin and a glass of champagne in hand. "Alex, you've always claimed that money can buy anything, right?" Ryan said, breaking the silence. Alex sipped his champagne with a calm, unreadable expression. "Because it can." Ryan leaned casually against the balcony rail, pointing toward a figure below. A woman sitting on the sidewalk, barefoot, wearing tattered clothes, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "See her?" Ryan said, his voice laced with challenge. "She's your next project. I bet $2 million you can't transform her into a socialite and stay married to her for 3 months. Alex's gaze hardened as he studied the woman. To him, she wasn't a person, but a piece in a game he couldn't resist. "$2 million?" he asked, his lips curling into a sardonic smile. "You clearly underestimate me." "Then let's see," Ryan replied, raising his glass. Alex said nothing, his focus fixed on the young woman below. She sat quietly, unaware of the wager being placed on her life, a cup of loose coins resting by her side. "Looks like tonight just got interesting," Alex murmured, before heading inside. Moments later, he was on the sidewalk, stepping toward the woman under the faint yellow streetlight. Her hunched figure became clearer as he approached. Her tangled hair framed a face etched with hardship but held an intriguing strength. A piece of cardboard with crooked writing lay in her lap. "Anything helps." "Excuse me," Alex said, his tone clipped and commanding. The woman looked up, startled, her dull green eyes meeting his. Despite her fatigue, there was a quiet defiance in her gaze. "What do you want?" she asked warily, shrinking back. Alex smirked, a mix of condescension and interest. "I have a proposition that could change your life." Her brows furrowed as suspicion clouded her face, but she remained silent. "I'm serious," Alex continued, crouching slightly to meet her eye level. "My name is Alex Walker. I'm wealthy, very wealthy, and I have a business proposal for you." "Business?" she scoffed, her voice bitter. Her worn smile revealed the cracks life had left behind. "I'm not a science experiment, Mr. Billionaire." Unfazed by her sarcasm, Alex pressed on. "This is straightforward. Marry me for 3 months. In return, you'll get a home, clothes, food, and money beyond your imagination." The woman blinked, her disbelief evident. "You're joking." "I don't joke about business," Alex replied coldly. "It's a simple deal. No strings attached. After 3 months, we go our separate ways, and you'll be free to start over with financial security." She hesitated, her mind racing. Life had been a string of losses, but his authoritative tone irritated her. "Why me?" "Because you're here," he said bluntly. His detached reasoning made her want to walk away, but the cold and her hunger pinned her in place. "My name is Grace Miller," she said softly. "And if I agree, how do I know this isn't a scam?" Alex pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Moments later, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. A sharply dressed chauffeur stepped out and opened the door. "Get in," Alex ordered. "We'll talk somewhere more comfortable." Grace hesitated but ultimately climbed into the car, unable to resist the promise of warmth, even if temporary. The silence during the drive was thick. Grace stared out the window, her thoughts racing, while Alex typed on his phone, unfazed. When they arrived at an upscale hotel, they were escorted to a luxurious suite. Grace's eyes widened at the sight. Polished wood, soft carpets, and a city skyline she'd only ever dreamed of. Alex ordered food and fresh clothes to be brought up while Grace kept her distance, watching him cautiously. "Relax," Alex said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "This is just a deal. I have no intention of harming you." Soon, room service arrived, and Grace ate without hesitation, savoring the first proper meal she'd had in weeks. Alex observed her with calculating interest, studying her every move. "So, do you agree or not?" he asked as she finished. Grace wiped her mouth and met his gaze, the weight of her decision heavy in her mind. Deep breath. "How much are you paying me?" Grace asked. $1 million, Alex replied, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Grace almost choked. The amount was staggering. With that kind of money, she could rebuild her life, maybe even help others like her. Yet the thought of compromising her dignity gnawed at her. "I need guarantees," she said, trying to maintain control of the situation. Alex nodded, unfazed. "Everything will be in writing. My lawyer will draft a contract. You'll have food, clothes, and your own room in my mansion." "And the wedding?" she asked hesitantly. "Tomorrow," Alex replied curtly. "It'll be quick, just a formality." Grace ran her fingers through her hair, feeling cornered. His tone left no room for negotiation. After a long pause, she sighed and nodded. "All right." Alex stood, satisfied. "Excellent. Rest tonight. Tomorrow begins the first day of the rest of our lives." Grace watched him leave the suite, leaving her alone in the lavish room. The silence was almost deafening. She knew her choice was risky, but what other option did she have? The next morning, Grace was awakened by a soft knock at the door. A housekeeper entered, carrying a breakfast tray and neatly folded clothes. Grace noticed the fine fabrics, neutral colors, and how perfectly everything was tailored. As she ate, the weight of her decision pressed down on her. Selling 3 months of her life felt surreal, but the promise of $1 million made her head spin. Shortly after, Alex appeared, impeccably dressed, holding a leather folder. He handed it to her. "Here's the contract. Read it, sign it, and we'll meet at the courthouse at 2 o'clock. Grace flipped through the document, scanning clauses and terms that outlined every detail of the agreement. It all seemed legitimate, yet impersonal. With a deep breath, she signed, each stroke of the pen feeling like a step into the unknown. The wedding was quick and emotionless. A judge recited the words. They signed the papers. Grace Miller was now officially Grace Walker, wife of Alex Walker. The only witnesses were Alex's lawyer and chauffeur. As they left the courthouse, Alex placed a hand on her back, guiding her to the car. It wasn't affectionate but mechanical, as if fulfilling an obligation. "And now?" Grace asked as the car moved through the busy streets. "Now, we go to my mansion," Alex replied without looking up from his phone. The Walker mansion exceeded her expectations. Tall wrought iron gates opened to a sprawling estate with manicured gardens and a grand house with white columns. Inside, a team of staff greeted them. Alex gave them swift instructions to prepare a room for Grace, who remained silent, overwhelmed by her surroundings. By nightfall, Alex invited her to dinner. The dining room was cavernous, dominated by a long table under a sparkling crystal chandelier. Grace sat at one end, Alex at the other. The distance felt symbolic. "How are you settling in?" Alex asked casually. "I'm not used to this kind of luxury," Grace admitted, glancing around. "You'll get used to it," Alex replied, a faint smile crossing his face. After dinner, Alex walked Grace to her room. Their voices echoed softly in the hallway until she stopped and turned to him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, voicing the question that had haunted her since the proposal. Alex crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. "Because I can." Grace narrowed her eyes, her anger mixing with curiosity. "This isn't random. People like you don't do things like this without a reason. Alex didn't answer, offering only a faint smile before stepping away. Get some rest. Tomorrow, your transformation begins. Later that night, Grace sat alone in her room, memories from her past resurfacing. It wasn't just the grandeur of the mansion that unsettled her. Something about Alex felt eerily familiar. Suddenly, a memory flashed in her mind. Years ago, she had been at an interview, her best outfit pressed, her resume carefully prepared. The company? Walker Enterprises. The interviewer? Alex Walker. She recalled his cold dismissal. We don't waste time on amateurs. That moment had shattered her confidence and marked the beginning of her downward spiral. And now, she was married to the man who had unknowingly destroyed her life. Anger burned in her chest. How could he not remember her? Or worse, did he remember and simply not care? Determined, Grace left her room and headed for the study, where Alex sat reviewing documents. I need to ask you something, she said, crossing her arms. Alex looked up, startled by the intrusion. What is it? Do you really not remember me? Grace's voice wavered with emotion. Alex frowned, clearly puzzled. Should I? Grace clenched her fists, struggling to keep her composure. A few years ago, I came to your company looking for a job. You humiliated me in front of everyone. Alex studied her, his expression blank as if trying to recall. Finally, he shrugged. I interview dozens of people every month. I don't remember all of them. His indifference felt like a dagger. Of course you don't, Grace replied bitterly. To you, we're all disposable. Alex didn't respond, but her words seemed to linger. He stood and took a step toward her, but she turned and left before he could speak. Alone in her room, Grace reflected on the encounter. This wasn't just a transactional agreement. It was a chance to confront the man who had once shattered her confidence. But she wasn't the same woman she'd been back then. The next morning, sunlight poured through the grand windows, and Grace resolved not to let her emotions consume her. After a shower, she went downstairs for breakfast, where Alex was already seated, engrossed in a newspaper. Good morning, she greeted, her tone neutral. Alex nodded without looking up. The silence was suffocating, but Grace refused to let it intimidate her. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down. So, what's next? She finally asked. Alex lowered the newspaper, a faint smile playing on his lips. Your transformation begins. A team of stylists, etiquette coaches, and posture trainers will work with you. Soon, you'll be introduced to high society as my wife. Grace rolled her eyes. As if expensive clothes and a fake smile will erase everything I've been through. Alex ignored the jab. Next week's business dinner will be your first test. I need you to be flawless. The days that followed were intense. From dawn to dusk, Grace endured endless fittings, etiquette lessons, and posture drills. Though she loathed the superficiality, she found herself adapting. Meanwhile, Alex kept his distance but couldn't ignore how Grace's presence was subtly changing the dynamic of the house. She wasn't like anyone he'd known. She challenged him at every turn. One afternoon, while Grace practiced walking gracefully in the grand hall, Alex entered and watched silently. When she noticed him, she stopped and crossed her arms. Enjoying the show? She asked sarcastically. Alex smiled faintly. Just assessing your progress. You're doing well. Grace scoffed. Glad I meet your standards, Mr. Walker. Alex stepped closer, his expression unreadable. Why does it always feel like you're ready to attack me? Maybe because you deserve it, Grace shot back without hesitation. Alex paused, taken aback by her candor, then stepped back. Get ready. We're going out tonight. Where? Grace asked suspiciously. A private dinner at a restaurant. I want to see how you handle yourself in public. That evening, Grace donned an elegant dress for their outing. At the upscale restaurant, She drew admiring glances but felt uncomfortable under the scrutiny. Alex, however, was entirely at ease. During dinner, Grace's nervousness was evident. She fidgeted and avoided prolonged eye contact. "Relax," Alex said in a low voice. "You're doing great." Grace looked up, surprised by his tone. "I'm serious," Alex continued. "You'll adapt. Trust me." For a moment, Grace saw something different in him. Beneath the cold, calculated exterior, there was a glimmer of something human, something vulnerable. On the ride back to the mansion, the atmosphere was lighter. Alex offered feedback on her performance at dinner, but his critique was surprisingly constructive, not harsh. "You're really taking this seriously, aren't you?" Grace asked, intrigued. Alex glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "I always take my bets seriously." The mention of the bet made Grace tense. She still didn't know what Alex stood to gain, but the idea of being just a pawn in his game left a bitter taste. That night, restless and curious, Grace decided to explore the mansion. Wandering through the quiet corridors, she came upon a slightly open door leading to an office. Inside, a massive desk was cluttered with documents. Intrigued, Grace stepped closer, her eyes scanning the papers. What she saw next left her frozen in place. A printed conversation between Alex and another man detailing the bet. "So, has she agreed?" one message read. "Yes, it's only a matter of time before I win," Alex's reply stated, the words dripping with cold indifference. Grace's stomach churned. She had suspected there was more to Alex's actions, but seeing the proof in black and white made the betrayal unbearable. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Alex stepped in, his expression hardening as he saw the papers in her hands. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his tone low and tense. Grace turned to him, her hands trembling as she clutched the papers. "Is this how you see me? Just a bet to stroke your ego?" Alex stepped closer, attempting to grab the papers, but Grace pulled back. "Answer me," she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not as simple as it seems." "Not simple?" Grace let out a bitter laugh. "You've been toying with my life like I'm disposable." "Grace," Alex began, but she cut him off. "Don't you dare try to justify this," she shouted, throwing the papers onto the desk. Without waiting for a response, she stormed out of the office. Alex stood frozen, staring at the scattered papers. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had lost control. Grace ran to her room, her heart pounding in her chest. Locking the door, she leaned against it, trying to calm herself. The discovery of the bet had shattered any tolerance she had built up over the past few days. "I can't stay here," she thought, tears of anger and humiliation streaming down her face. That night, while the mansion was silent, Grace put her plan into action. She dressed in plain clothes and packed a small bag with the few belongings she had. Quietly, she opened her window, climbed down the trellis covered in rose vines, and escaped into the cold night. The air was biting as she reached the ground. Looking back at the mansion, she felt an urge to scream, to make Alex feel the pain she carried. Instead, she turned and walked toward the road, never looking back. The streets were empty, and Grace wandered for hours. Exhaustion and the cold gnawed at her, but she pressed on. By the time she reached the city center, she found shelter in a subway station, curling up on a bench to rest. Back at the mansion, Alex woke early and noticed Grace's absence at breakfast. At first, he wasn't alarmed, assuming she needed space after their argument. But when the staff mentioned they hadn't seen her since dinner, a chill ran down his spine. "Check her room," he ordered, his voice tense. Minutes later, the butler returned with a worried expression. "Mr. Walker, her room is empty, and the window, it's open." Alex ran upstairs, entering her room. The bed was untouched. Her clothes still hung in the closet, but the window was ajar. He noticed marks on the trellis below. "She ran away," he murmured, clenching his fists. Without wasting time, Alex grabbed his phone and began calling his contacts, desperate to find her. The thought of Grace wandering the streets alone unsettled him deeply. It wasn't just about the bed anymore. Guilt and something unfamiliar, regret, drove him to act. Meanwhile, Grace trudged through the city, her strength fading. Exhaustion and a rising fever weighed her down, but she refused to stop. Every step was a testament to her resilience, a defiant statement that she wouldn't let anyone control her again. At dawn, she reached a small square and collapsed onto a wooden bench. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred, and her pride kept her from asking for help. Closing her eyes, she finally gave in to exhaustion. Alex, on the other hand, was already searching the streets. Driving his car, he scanned every corner and bench, guilt gnawing at him. He had never considered how much his actions might hurt someone, and now it consumed him. Hours later, with the sun high in the sky, Alex finally found her. Grace lay curled up on a bench under a thin blanket someone had likely given her. Her face was pale, and she was shivering with fever. "Grace," Alex called, running toward her. She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze unfocused. When she saw him, her voice was barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here too." Alex hesitated, his voice softening as he knelt beside her. "I'm here to take you home," Alex said, his voice firm but tinged with concern. "I don't have a home," Grace replied bitterly. Alex ignored her words and, despite her weak attempts to resist, gently picked her up and carried her to the car. On the way to the hospital, he said nothing, his thoughts racing. He realized it would take more than words to mend the trust he had shattered. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed Grace was severely dehydrated and running a high fever. Alex stayed by her side, watching as the medical staff cared for her. A heavy guilt pressed on his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt a loss of control over his own life. Hours later, Grace opened her eyes to find Alex sitting at her bedside. He looked exhausted, his face shadowed with worry. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice faint. "Because I care," Alex replied softly. Grace let out a weak laugh, her voice a whisper. "You don't know what it means to care about anyone but yourself." Alex lowered his head, gripping his knees tightly. "Maybe you're right, but I'm trying to change." Grace watched him warily, unsure of his sincerity. Her mind was too tired to fully process his words, and she let the silence hang between them. The next morning, Grace woke to the soft sound of footsteps. Turning her head, she saw a nurse adjusting her fore. The sight was comforting, but it also reminded her of how vulnerable she had become. The door opened moments later, and Alex entered, carrying a small paper bag. He was dressed casually, a stark contrast to his usual polished look. "I brought something for you," he said, placing the bag on the table beside her. Grace didn't respond, watching him silently. "It's soup," Alex continued, opening the bag. "You need to regain your strength." "I don't want anything from you," Grace replied, her voice cold and hoarse. Alex sighed but didn't argue. He stayed seated, allowing the silence to fill the room. "Why are you here, Alex?" Grace finally asked, breaking the quiet. He hesitated, then leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Because I care." Grace let out a bitter laugh. "You don't know what that means." Alex met her gaze. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've spent my whole life not truly caring about anyone. But you've made me see things I didn't want to face." Grace turned her head away, gripping the bed sheet tightly. "That doesn't change what you did." "I know," Alex said heavily. And I don't expect you to forgive me anytime soon, but I'll prove that I can be different. Grace said nothing, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, but her wounds were still raw. In the days that followed, Alex remained by Grace's side, ensuring she had everything she needed. He coordinated with the doctors, brought her meals, and even gave her books to help pass the time. Grace, though still resentful, couldn't ignore his efforts. One afternoon, as she flipped through one of the books Alex had brought, she found a folded letter tucked between the pages. It was handwritten, the script bold and firm. Grace, I know words aren't enough to undo what I've done, but I need you to know I'm trying. I've never been someone who admits mistakes, but you've made me look in the mirror and see who I really am. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want to become someone worthy of your respect. Alex. Grace read the letter repeatedly, trying to decipher his intentions. Was he sincere, or was this another ploy to manipulate her? That night, when Alex entered the room, Grace held up the letter. "What is this?" she asked, her voice firm. Alex glanced at the letter. "It's my attempt to be honest." "Honest?" Grace shook her head. "You used me. You humiliated me. How can I believe anything you say?" Alex stepped closer but kept his distance. "I know I don't deserve your trust, but I'm here. I'll stay here, even if it takes years to earn it." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she blinked them away. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you." "I understand," Alex said quietly. The next day, the doctors informed Grace that she was well enough to leave. Alex quickly arranged for her discharge and brought her back to the mansion. Grace, though hesitant, had no other place to go. When they arrived, Alex led her to a surprise. One of the rooms had been transformed into an art studio, complete with canvases, brushes, and paints in every color imaginable. "What is this?" Grace asked, stunned. "You mentioned once that you liked painting," Alex said, his voice soft. "I thought you might like a space of your own." Grace was speechless. It was a simple gesture, but it carried deep meaning. For the first time, she glimpsed something in Alex beyond the arrogant billionaire. In the days that followed, Grace spent more time in the studio, rediscovering her love for painting. The act of creating gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. Alex, respecting her need for space, kept his distance while quietly ensuring her comfort. One afternoon, as Grace painted, Alex appeared in the doorway. He stood silently, watching her. "You're talented," he said at last. Grace paused, turning to look at him. "I didn't know you had an eye for art." Alex shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm learning." She laughed softly, a sound that felt foreign after so long. Their days at the mansion settled into a calmer rhythm. Grace spent most of her time in the studio, while Alex focused on his business. A fragile truce formed between them, unspoken but undeniable. But Alex wasn't satisfied. He knew that words wouldn't be enough to rebuild Grace's trust. He needed to act, not just to win her over, but to prove to himself that he could change. One afternoon, Alex entered the studio, where Grace was engrossed in her work. He waited patiently for her to acknowledge him, but she continued painting, deliberately ignoring him. "I need your help," he said finally, breaking the silence. Grace stopped, wiping her hands on a cloth. "My help?" Alex nodded. "I want to start supporting social projects, and I think you can help me figure out where to begin." She raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Since when do you care about that?" "Since I realized the world doesn't revolve around me," he admitted, his tone sincere. Grace hesitated, torn between distrust and the appeal of doing something meaningful. Finally, she sighed. "All right, but I'm not doing this for you." "I wouldn't expect anything else," Alex replied with a small smile. In the following days, Alex and Grace began visiting charities and community projects. He took her to shelters, schools, and rehabilitation centers. Grace observed a transformation in Alex. He listened to people's stories and seemed genuinely moved by their struggles. One visit, in particular, left an impact. They went to a shelter for women who had survived domestic violence. While Grace spoke with some of the residents, Alex crouched down to speak with a young woman holding a baby. "It's hard to trust people after what I've been through," the woman said, clutching the child protectively. Alex nodded, his expression serious. "I understand," he said softly. From a distance, Grace watched, surprised. She hadn't expected Alex to show such empathy. On the way home, the car ride was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Grace sensed a shift in Alex, though she wasn't ready to fully believe in it. One evening, Alex took a bold step. He arranged a private dinner for the two of them. The dining room was softly lit with candles and flowers, and quiet music played in the background. "What's this?" Grace asked as she entered the room. "A thank you," Alex replied, pulling out a chair for her, "for helping me these past few days." Grace hesitated, but eventually sat down. The dinner was unlike any they had shared before. Alex was open, sharing stories about his childhood and the pressures he had faced growing up. "I think I used money as a shield," he admitted, staring into his wine glass. "It was easier than dealing with people." Grace listened quietly, absorbing every word. She had never imagined Alex admitting something so personal. "And now," she finally asked, "what do you want?" Alex looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I want to be better. Someone you might one day respect." She was silent for a long moment. "That doesn't depend only on you, Alex." "I know," he said with a sigh, "but I'll keep trying." After dinner, while Alex cleared the table, Grace returned to her studio and retrieved a small canvas. It was a serene landscape she had painted, a field under a bright sky, open and full of possibility. She brought it to Alex and held it out to him. "Here." He took the painting, his expression softening. "You made this?" Grace nodded. "For you. It's not much, but it's a start." Alex smiled, the first genuine one Grace had ever seen. "Thank you, Grace." In the days that followed, Alex's small but significant changes became more noticeable. He treated the mansion staff with respect, listened to suggestions from his employees, and dedicated himself to the social projects he and Grace had started. Grace, in turn, began to cautiously lower her defenses. She knew trusting Alex again would be a long and complicated process, but slowly, something within her started to shift. One afternoon, as they strolled through the mansion's garden, Alex suddenly stopped. "I want to show you something," he said. Curious, Grace followed him to a small cabin at the edge of the property. Inside, the space was filled with mementos from Alex's childhood, photos, old toys, and even crayon drawings he'd made as a boy. "I've never shown this to anyone," he admitted. Grace picked up a photo of a young Alex standing beside an elegant woman. "Is this your mother?" Alex nodded. "She always said money could buy many things, but never happiness. It took me a long time to understand that." Grace placed the photo back on the shelf and turned to him. "Maybe there's still time to learn." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Grace wandered back through the garden. The recent days had been overwhelming, filled with unexpected moments. She could feel something shifting within herself, though she wasn't ready to fully let her guard down. That evening, Alex appeared in the art studio as Grace finished a painting. He hesitated at the door, a rare moment of vulnerability for the usually confident man. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice almost timid. Grace glanced at him for a moment before nodding. Alex stepped inside, watching the canvas she was working on. "It's beautiful," he said, referring to the landscape she had painted. "Thank you," Grace replied, keeping her focus on the painting. Alex took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something." something I've never shared with anyone. Intrigued, Grace set down her brush and turned to him. I'm listening. Alex began pacing the studio, his hands shoved into his pockets as though he was gathering courage. When I was a kid, my mother was my only connection to the real world. My father was a cold man who believed success came before everything, family included. He taught me to be ruthless, to never show weakness. Alex paused, his eyes distant. My mother, on the other hand, believed love and empathy mattered more than any amount of money. But she died when I was 12. After that, my father made sure I became the man he wanted. Cold, calculating, driven by numbers. Grace listened intently, her heart softening as she heard the pain in his voice. And now, she asked gently. Alex shook his head. Now, I know there's more to life than I was willing to see. You've shown me that. A heavy silence hung between them before Grace finally spoke. I have something to say too. Alex looked at her, curiosity in his eyes. When you humiliated me in that interview years ago, it broke me. It was the moment I lost all faith in myself, Grace said, her voice trembling. Alex's expression fell. He felt the weight of her words like a punch to the gut. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. For the first time, Grace saw a vulnerable man stripped of his usual arrogance. She knew forgiveness would take time, but at that moment, she decided to take the first step. I want to believe you, Alex, she said, but trust isn't rebuilt overnight. I know, Alex replied solemnly, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. In the days that followed, Alex and Grace worked more closely together on their social projects. They visited underserved communities, listening to the struggles of people who reminded Grace of her own hardships. During one visit, they met a young woman named Lily who was on the verge of dropping out of school due to financial difficulties. Grace, moved by her story, turned to Alex with determination. Can we help? Alex smiled. We can, and we will. Support meant the world to Lily. With the scholarship and financial aid, she now had a chance to pursue her dreams. Seeing the joy in Lily's eyes warmed Grace's heart. It felt as though, in helping Lily, she was also healing parts of herself. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Grace sat in the living room, watching the fire crackle in the fireplace. Alex entered quietly and took a seat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Today was special, he said, breaking the silence. Grace nodded. Yes, it was. They sat in a peaceful quiet until Alex spoke again. Grace, can I ask you something? She turned to him, waiting. Do you think there's still a chance for us? Grace's heart raced at the question. It wasn't easy to answer, but she knew she needed to be honest. I don't know, Alex. I think we still have a lot to work through. Alex nodded, accepting her answer without protest. He knew that if there was any hope, it would take time and consistent effort to prove his sincerity. The days passed, and life at the mansion settled into a steady rhythm. Grace became deeply involved in the social projects, and Alex continued to show small but meaningful changes. Although the emotional distance between them began to narrow, Grace remained cautious about trusting him completely. One sunny afternoon, Alex invited Grace for a walk in the garden. She hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. As they strolled among the flowers, Alex shared his plans for a new project, a community center to provide education and job training for those in vulnerable situations. I want you to lead it with me, he said, smiling encouragingly. Grace stopped, surprised. Me? Yes. You understand these people's needs better than anyone, and I trust you. She stood in silence, absorbing his words. Though doubt lingered, Grace couldn't deny the warmth growing in her heart. I'll think about it, she replied. Alex nodded, respecting her need for time. Later that day, while Grace was in the art studio, she received an unexpected call. It was Clara, an old friend from her time on the streets. Clara's voice, full of emotion, stirred a mix of nostalgia and joy. Grace, I heard you're doing well and working on social projects. I need to see you, Clara said, almost breathless. Grace arranged to meet her at a cafe downtown the next day. When she told Alex about the meeting, he insisted on accompanying her. I won't interfere, but I want to make sure you're safe, he said seriously. Grace rolled her eyes but agreed. The next day, as Grace waited for Clara at the cafe, she felt a tinge of nervousness. It had been years since they last met, and she didn't know what to expect. When Clara finally arrived, the two embraced warmly, reminiscing about the hard times they had endured together. You've changed, Grace, Clara said after a while. You seem stronger. I'm still learning, Grace replied modestly. As they talked, Grace noticed Alex sitting discreetly at a nearby table. Though he was there solely for her safety, his presence brought her an unexpected sense of comfort. On the drive back to the mansion, Grace broke the silence. Thank you for bringing me here today. Alex glanced at her, surprised. There's no need to thank me. But I want to, she insisted. You've been different, and I've noticed. Alex was quiet for a moment before responding. I just want to do the right thing, Grace. The sincerity in his voice made her heart waver. Though she wanted to deny it, she couldn't ignore the fact that Alex was changing. However, their fragile peace was disrupted when Ryan, the friend who had proposed the bet, appeared at the mansion unannounced. His cynical smile and mocking tone filled the air. Alex, how's it going with your new wife? Ryan asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Grace, who was in the garden, froze when she heard his voice. Quietly, she moved closer, hiding behind a column to listen. What do you want, Ryan? Alex asked, irritation evident in his tone. Oh, I'm just curious. After all, the bet's almost up, isn't it? You must be looking forward to collecting your $2 million. Grace felt a chill run through her. Though she knew about the bet, hearing Ryan speak about it so carelessly reopened wounds she was still trying to heal. The bet doesn't matter anymore, Alex replied firmly. I canceled it. Michael laughed in disbelief. Canceled? You've got to be kidding me. I'm not, Alex said, his tone serious. I don't need the money, and I don't need the bet. Ryan looked at him skeptically. So, you're really falling for her? Alex didn't respond, but his expression spoke volumes. Grace stepped out from her hiding spot, her presence startling both men. Feel her heart tearing between anger and confusion. Is it true? She asked, her voice trembling. Alex turned, startled to see her. Grace, I can explain. I don't want explanations, Alex. I want the truth, she shouted, tears brimming in her eyes. Ryan, sensing the tension, stepped back uncomfortably. I think I'll leave you two to sort this out, he said before slipping away. As Ryan disappeared, Alex tried to approach Grace, but she took a step back. Did you cancel the bet? She asked, her voice shaking. Yes, I did, Alex replied firmly. Why? Alex took a deep breath. Because you're more important than any stupid challenge. Grace stood silently, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being hurt again was overwhelming. I don't know if I can trust you, Alex. Not after all this, she finally said. Then don't trust me, Alex replied, his tone calm yet resolute. Just watch. Let my actions prove what my words can't. Grace searched his eyes, trying to decipher his sincerity. Doubts lingered, but something deep inside told her he was telling the truth. The days after their confrontation were tense. Grace spent hours in the studio, wrestling with her thoughts, while Alex remained steadfast in proving his intentions. Despite the lingering distance, the visible transformation in Alex was undeniable. One morning, Grace sat on the terrace with a cup of tea, watching the gentle sway of the trees. Her mind wandered between the painful memories of the past and the tender moments of recent days. She knew she needed to make a decision, but the fear of trusting again left her paralyzed. Alex appeared in the doorway, hesitant, holding a folder in his hands. His expression was serious, but lacked the arrogance she once associated with him. "May I join you?" he asked, respecting her space. Grace nodded, and Alex sat at the table, placing the folder between them. "I brought something for you," he said, opening the folder and carefully pulling out a set of documents. "This is proof that I ended the bet. There's no longer any connection between me and Ryan." Grace picked up the papers, reading them carefully. The signatures and dates confirmed that Alex had not only canceled the bet, but also returned the money and donated a significant amount to charity. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, looking up at him. "Because I want you to know I'm being honest. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I want you to see that I'm trying to be a better man." Grace set the papers aside and turned her gaze back to the horizon. "You want to be different, but that doesn't change what happened," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It doesn't," Alex admitted, leaning forward slightly, "but I want you to know I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." The silence between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Grace knew she had to confront her own feelings about Alex sooner or later. The sincerity in Alex's eyes was clear, but Grace wasn't ready to fully trust him yet. "I want to believe you, Alex," she said softly, "but there's still a part of me that's afraid." Alex nodded, his tone steady and understanding. "And I'll keep trying. I'm not going to give up on proving I'm worthy of your trust." After dinner, Alex walked Grace back to her art studio. Before saying good night, he pulled something small from his pocket, a silver butterfly pendant. "My mom gave this to me when I was a child," he said, holding it out to her. "She used to say that butterflies symbolize transformation. I want you to have it as a reminder that we all have the ability to change." Grace took the pendant, feeling the symbolic weight of the gift. For a moment, she was speechless. Then she looked at Alex and gave him a faint smile. "Thank you," she said softly. In the days that followed, Grace began to notice small changes within herself. Although she still kept some distance from Alex, moments of connection started to happen naturally. A casual conversation in the garden, a glance exchanged during a meeting. These small gestures showed that the barrier between them was beginning to fade. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Alex suddenly stopped and looked at Grace. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her toward a small cabin at the back of the property. "This was my refuge," Alex explained with a nostalgic smile. Grace picked up one of the letters and read it silently. In it, a young Alex had written about his dreams and fears, revealing a vulnerable side she had never imagined. "You really are changing," she said, placing the letter back on the shelf. Alex looked at her, his eyes filled with hope. "I'm trying. For you." Grace stayed quiet for a moment before responding, "Maybe there's still a chance for us." The days following their visit to Alex's cabin were filled with introspection and hesitation. Grace knew she was nearing a crucial decision, but her fear of being hurt again made her hold back. Alex, on the other hand, seemed increasingly certain of his commitment. He didn't pressure Grace but made a point of being present, showing that he was willing to face any challenge to prove his transformation. One evening, while Grace was in the studio finishing a painting, Alex appeared at the door. He held 2 glasses of wine and seemed more relaxed than usual. "May I come in?" he asked with a slight smile. Grace nodded, and he approached, handing her one of the glasses. They stood in silence for a moment, observing the painting Grace was working on, a portrait of a butterfly perched on a flower, its vibrant colors standing out against the soft background. "It's beautiful," Alex said sincerely. "Thank you," Grace replied with a small smile. Alex took a sip of wine before speaking again. "You know, The transformation of a butterfly has always fascinated me. It starts as something so small and limited, but over time, it becomes something entirely different. Grace glanced at him, recognizing the parallel he was trying to draw. And you believe people can change like that? I believe they can, if they truly want to, he replied firmly. Grace stayed silent, processing his words. Despite her lingering doubts, she couldn't deny that Alex was different. The next morning, Alex announced he had planned a trip. I want to show you something special, he said mysteriously. Grace hesitated, but eventually agreed. A private plane took them to a small village nestled in the mountains, surrounded by breathtaking landscapes. Upon arrival, Alex led her to a simple yet cozy house he had prepared for the occasion. Why did you bring me here? Grace asked, intrigued. Alex looked around, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. This place reminds me of how life can be simple and yet so full of meaning. I wanted us to have a moment away from everything so we can truly connect. During their time in the village, Grace and Alex shared moments that once seemed impossible. They walked along forest trails, cooked simple meals together, and talked openly about their lives, hopes, and fears. Grace began to see a side of Alex he had hidden for so long, a deeply human side, a vulnerable side of Alex that deeply moved Grace. On one of their walks, as they rested by a serene lakeside, Alex broke the silence. Grace, I know I still have a lot to prove to you, he began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, this change in me is real. She looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his tone. And what do you want from me, Alex? Just a chance, he replied simply. Grace felt a lump in her throat. For so long, she had built walls around her heart, but standing before Alex, those walls were beginning to crumble. When they returned to the mansion, Grace felt different. There was a clarity in her thoughts that she hadn't felt in years, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could trust Alex again. Still, she knew any final decision had to be made carefully. The next morning, the crisp air and golden sunlight brightened the mansion. Grace woke slowly, the soft rays slipping through the curtains. Sitting up in bed, she took a deep breath, absorbing the peaceful silence of the house. Something inside her had shifted. The confusion that had haunted her was lifting, and for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. After their trip to the mountains, Grace realized the walls she had built around her heart were coming down. She remembered every moment she had shared with Alex, the heartfelt conversations, the unexpected laughter, and the care he had consistently shown. All of it pointed to a truth she could no longer deny. Alex had truly changed, and his presence was having a profound impact on her life. She went downstairs for breakfast and found Alex already at the table. He greeted her with a warm smile, setting aside the newspaper. "Good morning," he said in the gentle tone that had become his norm. "Good morning," Grace replied, sitting across from him. The silence between them was comfortable. Alex poured her a cup of coffee and watched as she took her first sip, sensing that something had shifted but not wanting to push her. After breakfast, Alex suggested a walk in the garden, and Grace agreed. Together, they strolled along the flower-lined paths, the quiet filled with birdsong and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. When they reached a small stone bench under an old tree, Alex stopped and turned to face her. "Grace, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice serious. She looked at him expectantly. "A while ago, I promised I'd do everything I could to earn back your trust. I need to know, have I made any progress?" Grace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his question. Meeting his gaze, she saw hope and vulnerability in his eyes. "You've changed, Alex," she admitted. "And yes, you're earning my trust back." Alex smiled, relief washing over his face, but there was something else he needed to say. Then I have another question, he said, lowering himself to one knee and pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Grace gasped as Alex opened the box to reveal a simple yet elegant diamond ring. Grace, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because of a contract, but because of love? His words hung in the air, and Grace felt tears welling in her eyes. For a moment, she was speechless, her heart racing. Finally, she smiled and nodded. Yes, Alex, I will. Alex slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced under the shade of the tree. It was a simple yet profoundly meaningful moment, marking the start of a new chapter in their lives. The wedding took place a few weeks later, in an intimate ceremony in the mansion's garden. Only a handful of close friends and partners from their social projects attended, but the atmosphere was filled with love and joy. Grace wore a light lace dress that made her look almost ethereal, while Alex, dressed sharply, couldn't take his eyes off her. During their vows, Alex held Grace's hands tightly, his voice brimming with emotion. Grace, you've taught me the true meaning of love, patience, and redemption. I promise to stand by your side through every moment, good or bad, and to dedicate my life to making you happy. With tears in her eyes, Grace responded, Alex, you've shown me that people can change, and that love can grow even in the most unlikely circumstances. I promise to love you and walk by your side as we build our future together. Their kiss was met with applause and smiles from the guests, sealing their commitment to one another. For the first time, Grace felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. The first year of their marriage brought challenges, but also moments of immense joy and growth. Together, Grace and Alex expanded their social projects, helping hundreds of people rebuild their lives. One morning, as they prepared breakfast together in the kitchen, Grace turned to Alex, her eyes filled with warmth. Alex, Grace said with a shy smile, her eyes sparkling, I have some news for you. Curious, Alex paused what he was doing and turned to her. What is it? We're going to have a baby, Grace revealed, her voice trembling with emotion. For a moment, Alex was speechless, his eyes widening. Then, a radiant smile broke across his face. He stepped closer and wrapped her in a tight embrace. This is wonderful, Grace, he exclaimed, his voice filled with joy. The news brought even more happiness into their lives. The following months were spent preparing the baby's room and planning their future as a family. The day their daughter, Emily Walker, was born was one of the most emotional moments in Grace and Alex's lives. Holding her for the first time, they both felt an overwhelming connection, as if all the struggles of their past had led them to this perfect moment. She's perfect, Grace whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Just like her mother, Alex replied softly, gently stroking Emily's tiny head. Emily's arrival transformed their home. The mansion, once marked by coldness and formality, became warm and filled with love. The laughter of their daughter brought a newfound joy to every corner. The following years were marked by achievements and growth. The community center Alex and Grace had founded became a beacon of hope, providing opportunities for thousands of people. Grace continued her art, using her talent to raise funds for social causes, while Alex mentored young entrepreneurs, inspiring them to create businesses with a purpose. Emily grew up surrounded by love, her laughter filling their lives with light. Alex and Grace, now partners in every sense, looked to the future with hope and gratitude. One evening, as they stood by Emily's crib, watching her sleep peacefully, Alex reached for Grace's hand and whispered, "You've changed my life in ways I never imagined." Grace smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And you've shown me that love can bloom in the most unexpected places." Together, they gazed at their sleeping daughter, knowing that no matter what challenges awaited, they would face them side by side, united by the love that had transformed them both. Do you think Grace made the right decision by forgiving Alex? Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you rate this story from 0 to 10? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to keep up with all our stories. Be sure to check out more emotional tales by clicking here on the end screen. See you in the next stories.